The dusty red road, stretching endlessly under the scorching sun of the Wild West, was like a thin thread connecting two destinies. The old horse-drawn carriage creaked along, each turn of its wheels a sigh of time, carrying Clara, a 19-year-old girl, and the strange man she was about to marry. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the dry clatter of hooves on the hard ground, and the whistling wind through the thorny bushes, carrying the desert's heat. Clara sat upright, her white wedding dress already stained with road dust, its crumpled folds reflecting her own tumultuous life. Her blue eyes, deep and resolute, stared straight ahead, towards the small church dimly appearing on the horizon, a tiny gray dot against the vast blue sky. It was a dilapidated wooden church, standing isolated in the desolate plains, like an old scar on the barren land, a symbol of solitude and forgotten nest dot inside. Flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the weathered, grim faces of the few. Local residents invited, people Clara had never met, and likely never would again. There was no laughter, no blessings, no warm glances exchanged. Only the wind whistling through a broken window, carrying the cold breath of loneliness into every nook and cranny, and the monotonous drone of the preacher's prayers, dry as old, faded books. Clara felt her chest tighten, a cold dread enveloping her, but she refused to tremble. Her breathing was steady, though her mind was a chaotic mess of fear, despair, and an iron will. This marriage was not for love, not for a promise of happiness or a bright future. For her, it was the only door, the last escape route from her abusive father, a haunting phantom of her childhood, who had turned every day of her life into a battle for survival, a relentless fight. James, the man standing beside her, was tall and rugged like a weathered rock, standing there like a living statue. He was 35, but his face was deeply etched with the lines of sun, wind, and time, his harsh features as if life had carved untold stories and unspeakable pains onto them. His gray eyes were distant, holding an unnamed sorrow, an unsettling emptiness that Clara could not comprehend. He did not look at her. His gaze swept past the old church walls, towards a distant place in his past, where he had perhaps lost everything: family, happiness, and even himself. For James, this marriage was merely a simple arrangement, an unspoken agreement to have an extra pair of hands to help on his solitary ranch, a way to fill the void in his empty house. He needed someone to maintain the home, a presence to ward off the ghosts of the past, though he sought neither a heart nor a deep connection. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, no one exchanged a touch, a glance, or even a forced smile. No rings were exchanged, only a silent, heavy acceptance, like an invisible burden placed upon both their shoulders. The wooden door creaked open, like a sigh of fate, a farewell to what was gone and a welcome to what was to come. They stepped outside into the dazzling sunlight of the late afternoon, two solitary figures casting long shadows on the dusty ground, walking parallel but never touching, like two boats drifting on a vast ocean, each carrying its own pain. The wind blew strong, swirling up red dust, gradually obscuring the church behind them, as if erasing the traces of an emotionless ceremony. They were heading towards an unknown future, with only silence and the Wild West as witnesses to their journey. The journey to James's ranch lasted until the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the western sky purple. The small, simple wooden house appeared in the dim light of dusk, nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by barren hills and thorny bushes like a tiny dot in the vastness of nature. It looked like a part of that harsh landscape, bearing the marks of loneliness and time, of the years James had lived alone. The smell of old wood, dust, and a hint of dampness lingered in the air as Clara stepped across the threshold, a strange yet haunting scent. The house had only 2 rooms, a living room that doubled as a kitchen with a stone fireplace, and a small bedroom, just enough for a bed and a wardrobe. Everything was dark and bare, containing only the most essential items: devoid of any warmth or a woman's touch. Clara began her new life in almost absolute silence, a silence she was all too familiar with from her years with her abusive father. Every morning, before the sun appeared, when the stars still twinkled in the dark sky, James was already awake. She heard his heavy footsteps leaving the house, the creaking sound of the barn door opening, the jingling of the cows' bells, and the horses' whinnies echoing in the cold morning air. He worked the land from dawn till dusk, tending to the livestock, mending the rotting fences, tilling the barren soil. He returned when it was pitch black, his face streaked with dust and sweat, his shoulders heavy with fatigue, but his eyes remained resolute, never complaining. He ate the dinner Clara prepared, usually simple meals like dried meat, cornbread, and stewed beans, then sat by the fireplace, watching the crackling flames without uttering a word, as if searching for an answer in the flickering fire. The firelight illuminated his face, highlighting his angular features and his harsh demeanor, casting long shadows on the walls. Clara, too, remained silent. She swept the house, scrubbed away years of grime, and neatly rearranged the cluttered items. She cooked, washed James's old clothes, and mended torn patches. Every movement she made was gentle, cautious, as if afraid of breaking the fragile shell of peace she was trying to build, a peace she had never known. She did not speak to him, and he did not speak to her. The silence between them was not hostility or estrangement, but a familiar void, a no-man's land that both had grown accustomed to, where pains were hidden. The wind seeped through the unlatched door, carrying the whisper of the prairie sometimes, the distant howl of coyotes, or the neigh of a horse in the night, the sounds of the wild. The fire in the hearth was the only warm light in the house, casting shadows of two figures sitting far apart, each immersed in their own world, in unspoken thoughts, in sorrowful memories. They were two islands, drifting side by side on a vast, still ocean, never touching, yet no longer entirely alone. Each day passed. They lived under the same roof, breathed the same air, but remained two separate worlds, separated only by an invisible space, a wall of past wounds. Time passed, slowly like a dry river on the arid prairie, bringing subtle yet meaningful changes. Gradually, Clara began to notice small details in James's life, things she hadn't paid attention to initially, obscured by her own fear and worries. He always left a portion of his food for his old dog, a gray-furred hound with sad eyes, who always curled up on the porch, like his only loyal friend. He always checked that the barn door was securely latched every night, and sometimes she saw him standing silently watching the cattle graze under the moonlight, a contemplative look on his face. There was a quiet care, an unspoken concern in those small actions, a hidden heart beneath his rough exterior. Clara began to change her own small habits, changes she never spoke aloud. She no longer cooked only the simplest meals for survival. She started experimenting, adding a little more spice to the stew, roasting a piece of meat a bit crispier the way he liked it, brewing a stronger cup of coffee for him on cold mornings. She didn't know if he noticed, but she kept doing it as a way to show her care. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in warmth, Clara sat there, needle and thread in hand. She found an old, worn tablecloth and began to embroider simple patterns onto it. Her stitches were even, meticulous, as if she were reweaving every broken piece of her soul, every fear and every hope. She embroidered wild flowers she saw growing by the roadside, small sparrows perched on the fence, and then she began to embroider images of the Wild West, a galloping horse, a blooming cactus, a distant mountain. Her hands moved swiftly, the needle gliding over the fabric, creating a small, colorful world, a world she could control. James returned, stopping at the threshold, his gaze casually sweeping over her nimble hands. For a brief moment, his eyes lingered on the emerging tablecloth, on her meticulous stitches, then drifted away, as if he hadn't noticed. But Clara felt it. A small shift, a fragile connection, an invisible acknowledgement. Sometimes when James was mending the fence under the harsh sun, sweat trickling down his face, Clara brought him water. She placed the tin canteen beside him without a word. He took it, nodded, and his eyes met hers over his shoulder, not directly, but enough for her to feel an acceptance, a presence that was no longer strange. It wasn't indifference, but a quiet respect, a private space being preserved, a permission for her to enter his world. Her eyes welled up, but no tears fell. It wasn't sadness, but a strange sense of safety, of belonging, a seed of hope blossoming in her heart, a feeling she had never known. The silence was no longer emptiness, but a space for them to sense each other, for invisible threads to be woven, little by little, becoming stronger. The peaceful days passed, bringing a fragile comfort, a tranquility Clara had never dared to dream of. But the Wild West never allowed peace to last forever. It always harbored dangers, ghosts from the past that could strike at any moment. One morning, as the sun just appeared over the mountains, painting the eastern sky with streaks of fiery orange, a sense of unease crept into Clara's mind. The wind today carried a strange scent, not the familiar smell of dry grass or dust, but something sharp, unpleasant, the scent of threat. She stood at the kitchen door, a ceramic plate in her hand, preparing breakfast, when she suddenly felt a cold shiver run down her spine, an ominous premonition. Then she saw him. A dark figure appeared at the end of the dirt road, shrinking then, growing larger, heading straight for the house like an approaching dust storm. It was a terrifyingly familiar figure, a nightmare resurrected from the past she had tried so hard to bury. Clara's father. His face was grim, his eyes bloodshot, and his gait heavy, brutal, each step crushing the peace. The breath of the past suddenly rushed back, engulfing Clara in absolute terror, a primal fear, colder than the desert wind. She stood frozen at the kitchen door, her hands trembling uncontrollably, dropping the ceramic plate to the floor. The deafening crash shattered the morning silence, echoing throughout the house. Like a desperate cry, James was outside, checking his old wagon, the creaking of wood and metal resonating steadily. He heard the jarring sound and turned. His gaze quickly swept over Clara, standing motionless, her face pale with fear, then stopped at the approaching figure. He saw the man, saw the utter terror in Clara's eyes, and a familiar feeling welled up within him, an old pain, a scar that would never heal. He remembered his wife's face, remembered his son's piercing cries, all taken away by the brutality of a lawless world, by heartless men who had ruined his life. Those images, thought to be buried deep beneath layers of time, suddenly came alive, sharp and painful as if they had happened yesterday. His heart, which he thought had turned to stone after so many years of solitude, suddenly throbbed violently, a sharp, piercing pain. He walked slowly towards the house, each step heavy, as if he were dragging his entire painful past, but his eyes did not waver. There was only a cold determination, a fire burning deep within his gray eyes. Clara's father stopped at the porch, his eyes sweeping over Clara, who was cowering in the corner of the kitchen, trembling like a small animal cornered, then stopped at James, who stood blocking the doorway. Towering like a mountain, he began to shout vulgar and threatening words, echoing through the valley, shattering the morning's tranquility. He demanded Clara return. He insulted James, calling him a wife-stealer, a useless man. Clara recoiled, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes pleading for help, but no sound escaped her throat. Fear had locked away her every word, every movement. James stood blocking the doorway, between Clara and her father like a steel wall. He said nothing, no sound escaping his lips. His face was stone cold, devoid of any emotion, but his eyes blazed with a fierce anger and protectiveness, an unwavering resolve. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but his muscles were taut, ready for whatever might happen. A silent confrontation unfolded, suffocatingly tense, the air thick with hostility. The shadows of the two figures stretched long on the ground, one tall and one shorter, like two warriors standing guard over something sacred, a boundary that could not be crossed, a freedom that had just begun to blossom. James did not need to explain, did not need to justify his actions. He simply stood there, a solid wall, an impenetrable fortress, protecting what he had silently accepted as his own. Clara's father recognized the unyielding determination in James's eyes. He saw a hidden danger, an unshakable strength, a real threat. He saw that this man was not someone to be easily intimidated. Finally he left, muttering curses, his figure gradually disappearing behind the trees, like a nightmare that had passed. When his shadow completely vanished, the tension in the air slowly dissipated, like a cool breeze blowing through. Clara still trembled, tears streaming down her face, but she did not cry aloud, only silent tears of relief. She looked up at James, her eyes full of gratitude and astonishment, as if she were looking at a savior. James turned to look at Clara. He saw that she was still afraid, but the panic in her eyes had lessened, replaced by a glimmer of trust. He reached out, gently touching her shoulder. An unspoken touch, soft yet firm, carrying all the comfort and protection, a promise unsaid. It was an affirmation that she was safe, that she was no longer alone. His heart was still broken, still carried the pain of past losses, the scars that would never heal, but for Clara, for the fragility and fear in her eyes, he had risen. He had chosen to protect, even though his heart was still bleeding, still held unhealed wounds. In that moment, an invisible thread was tightly woven between two lonely souls, a thread of trust and gratitude. After that incident, a subtle change, almost imperceptible, took place in the small house and in the relationship between Clara and James. The silence was no longer a dividing wall, but a space for two souls to breathe, to grow closer, to sense each other's presence more deeply. James no longer sat so far from the fireplace every evening. Sometimes he would sit a little closer, just enough for Clara to feel the warmth from his body, enough for her to hear his steady breathing in the night, a comforting sound. Clara continued to embroider, but now she embroidered images of the Wild West she had seen, images of her new life, a galloping horse, a blooming cactus, a flock of birds soaring in the blue sky, and even the image of a small house with smoke rising from its chimney. The old tablecloth was now full of color and life, each stitch a story, a piece of her life being rewoven, every fear replaced by new hopes. Her hands, once trembling with fear, were now steady and confident, as if she were weaving a new future, a life she herself would shape. One afternoon, as James was mending the fence damaged by the previous night's storm, replacing rotten planks with sturdy new ones, Clara brought him a warm jacket and a hot cup of coffee. The wind had begun to pick up, carrying the biting chill of evening, and dark clouds were gathering. He took the jacket and the coffee, and this time he didn't look over his shoulder, but looked directly into her eyes. A shared gaze, an understanding beyond words, a connection deeper than any language. In his eyes she saw the fatigue from a hard day's work, but also a strange peace, an acceptance of fate, and a hint of contentment. In her eyes he saw care, tenderness, and absolute trust. It was a brief moment, but it contained everything they needed to say, an unspoken promise for the future. The shadows of the two figures stretched long on the ground, one tall and one small, standing together by the unfinished fence, as if they were building something together, not just a fence, but a life, a family. The house door, once always closed, was now often left ajar, inviting in sunlight and fresh air, a symbol of openness. Meals were no longer in absolute silence. Sometimes James would nod when Clara placed food down, or Clara would smile faintly when he finished his portion. These small moments, these unspoken gestures, became their own language, a language of care and understanding. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, James sat there, no longer staring blankly into the flames, but sometimes his gaze would drift to Clara, who was sitting and embroidering beside him, and a very faint, almost imperceptible smile would briefly appear on his lips. They did not say, "I love you." Those words were too grand, too foreign to two souls who had endured too much pain, too much loss. Their love was not about grand vows or passionate kisses or sweet words. Their love was presence, protection, silent acceptance. Their love was the warm fire that burned steadily in the hearth of a small house, where two lonely souls had found each other, not because they needed love, but because they had found it, slowly, quietly, amidst the harsh Wild West. They stayed. They stayed together, not out of obligation, but because they had chosen each other, chosen to build a new life from the fragments of the past, a life woven from silence, understanding, and small but meaningful actions.